Bob, I mean, AUKUS sounded very much like music to our ears, at least, but the French are finding it less so.
Yes, they certainly are. They seem to have been very offended, which is fair enough. They had a big deal, and the Australians have changed their mind. When circumstances change, you change your opinions under some circumstances. And the Australians, I think, very wisely felt that the diesel subs would give them a significant disadvantage against potential Chinese, nuclear-powered or submarine technology. So I think they made the right decision. I understand why the French are offended, but let's hope we move on. I would just say one other thing, that our market in the UK, defence market, is an awful lot more open to French companies than France's defence market is to the UK. So if the French really want to go off in a huff, they will be the losers here significantly when it comes to a lot of their contractors bidding for contracts in our country, when we find it much more difficult to do the same in France.
I mean, there'll be some that say that this is just a sort of very Gallic reaction to what, amounts to tens of billions of lost dollars that France was looking to get from its sale of its diesel-powered submarines to Australia. But is this perhaps indicative of a slight reordering of the way global politics has been done, and that Britain, for a long time, over the past 5 decades, arguably, has been tilted towards a more European-driven sense of foreign policy, but now she's emancipated herself from the European Union, her transatlantic relationships and old Commonwealth relationships are now being pushed to the forefront. Do you think that this spells out a different future for a newly global Britain?
Yes, and so there are two very crucial points you've just raised there. There's one, just an immediate issue about France. The problem is with the French, they're not always the best of allies, and they're not always perceived to be the best of allies. And at a time when we have deepening defence relationships, it is really sort of continually, frankly, pathetic to see the way that Macron needs always to try to humiliate and to undermine. And when everyone was sort of talking about big global issues at G7, he was banging on about trying to prevent English sausages to Northern Ireland, or trying to cut off electricity, which is the sort of thing that you'd expect from the Russians, not the French, or try to hurt us over fishing rights. Their tedious jingoism really gets in the way of their relationship with us. And so my advice to the French would be actually sort of grow up and decide whether you want us to be allies, in which case let's do it properly, or whether you want us just to be the butt of your endless sort of political sort of posturing, in which case then the French have only themselves to blame. So that's the French. Let's move on to important stuff now. You're absolutely right. Britain's strategic culture prior to 1945 was that we were a seafaring, blue water naval power with an empire, and a trading empire above all else. After 45 and World War II, we were forced, because of the Soviets, to become a continental power with a large continental army in Germany. That's really been the exception to our history. So you're right, we're going back to what we were before World War II.
But how is this going to marry up now with reinvigorated EU ambitions to create some sort of semblance of foreign policy, an EU army? It seems to me rather ostentatiously ambitious for the EU to try and create a defence policy as a union of nations. But this is really the problem. Macron's been the pin-up boy for Brussels for a long time, and it seems to me that they're struggling now to find out which direction they should turn in the world, while we've been quite assertive.
The problem with that is that the EU posturing over defence, I fear, is always going to be just that. And most importantly, our adversaries and potential rivals, and sadly potential enemies, will see it as being just that as well. And an EU army will exist on paper, it'll exist in Brussels, it'll exist under a little EU flag, and they'll do some soft missions. But I worry that it will not have a hard capability. And if you want to deter wars in the future, and we need to be thinking about deterring the next war already, very sadly, then the way to do it is not with a paper army, which is frankly dangerous. The way that Europe works together with the UK is via NATO, because that's the underpinning. And frankly, the French don't have an airlift capacity. They don't have even the capacity that the UK has. So all these sort of ideas of French grandeur about a European army, it's just really dangerous and destabilizing. And I just hope they realize that the way forward is to work together, and frankly, work together with us in the Pacific as well. And I'd like to see AUKUS, or whatever we're calling it, expand to include, Canada. to include France, to include South Korea and Japan, or at least us go into some combined operation where we have an alliance of democracies throughout the world, increasingly almost an international NATO. So yes, we do deter and contain one-party states with territorial ambitions on others, like China, like Russia.
I mean, surely it's not even possible to make foreign affairs decisions when you're a collected group of states. Those things tend to happen very much at a domestic level, where you choose who you might partner with in foreign theatres of war. So I find it hard to understand how the EU could ever enact it. Like you said, very much a paper army. But how concerned should we be about this move via the EU and how much that could then undermine NATO?
You're right. The real damage of the European army is not necessarily going to have a capacity, because I suspect it won't, and it'll just be the capacity that they would be giving to NATO, minus the American spine, the massive logistics capability, and frankly the massive fighting capability that the US has, and after that the UK. So all it will really do is undermine NATO and embolden our enemies, whether it's Russia, who's already, I know I was listening to Tom talking very informatively about gas and energy supply. We're completely missing the big picture here, that this is a massive Russian power play to intimidate the EU into accepting Nord Stream 2, the new gas pipeline, so it can isolate Ukraine potentially as a precursor to further violence and significant, potentially conventional land invasion of eastern Ukraine. We are living in increasingly serious times, and French posturing is just massively unhelpful. We need to work together to really work to, what's the word I'm looking for, to deter adventurism from one-party states or from, ultra-conservative or neo-totalitarian states, not make it more likely by playing silly games about European armies.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Russia, because it is very much the elephant in the room in this argument. And there have been some allegations of certain Russian-owned companies engaging in activities such as price fixing and deliberately putting up prices. And, of course, Russia have just signed that major agreement with Germany bilaterally about delivering gas to Germany, bypassing any levy that Ukraine might be able to take from that. So let's delve into that a little bit more, because I don't think any other broadcaster is really looking into that issue. How afraid should we be that Russia essentially now, when it comes to Europe, has the ability to turn off the tap and make things extremely uncomfortable for us as winter approaches?
Okay, that's a really good point. We are collateral damage in a bigger game here. So we're not I was listening to all the questions and comments. I just asked one myself, and we were being a little bit parochial and missing the bigger picture. The bigger picture is that Nord Stream 2, this new gas pipeline, is about to be built. Actually, there isn't a supply problem into Europe, so we don't need one. The purpose of Nord Stream 2 is it bypasses Ukraine. So the Russians will supply gas directly into Germany. The Germans have not weaned themselves off Russian gas, and the Germans are sadly dependent on Russian gas. Effectively, Germany is paying for Russian hybrid war rearmament. It's not a great position to be in. Some countries are very smart and wise to this. The Poles, the Lithuanians especially, they see what strings Russian gas comes with, and they have weaned themselves off. In Lithuania's case, entirely, and I think now in Poland's case, entirely, if not almost entirely, they've weaned themselves off Russian gas because they've set up liquid gas facilities, and they're now getting their gas from America or the Middle East as well. Unfortunately, the Germans are entirely dependent on Russian gas, and the Russians could really kick off rough about that. The Russian aim here is to force Europe, the EU, into accepting Nord Stream 2 because there is a legal case against it. And once Nord Stream 2 goes ahead, that leaves Ukraine isolated. It will not get the transit fees. And it means that actually it becomes less geostrategically important. And because of German dependency on Russian gas, it probably makes Ukraine more vulnerable, not only to Russia's hybrid war, the use of proxies, the assassinations, the information warfare, the energy warfare, the political warfare, but actually straightforward conventional invasion as well. So we are increasingly living in dangerous times, whether the final outcome of Nord Stream 2 may be a conventional invasion of eastern Ukraine, or certainly the threat of it, unless Ukraine federalizes so that Russia can get a grip of the eastern part of Ukraine and drag it back into its sphere of interest, which ultimately Putin wants. Putin wants two things in the last 10 years in power. He wants to try to break NATO, and he wants to destroy Ukraine as an independent state. And if we get it really badly wrong, we'll end up in conflict with the Russians. So we need to think about this seriously, and there's not enough serious thinking happening.
Well, how much of this is product of the fact that we had an opportunity to pursue other technologies such as fracking to create a gas supply back here domestically that potentially we could have imported to the rest of Europe, thereby somehow stymieing that dependency on Putin's gas? Do you think that was an incredible missed opportunity in the UK?
Well, OK, we are not very dependent on Putin's gas. It's the Germans here. We are, as I say, we're collateral players here. The key audience here, the key target is the German political elite and the business elites, and that the fact that Germany is dependent on Russian gas. So we're collateral damage. So could we be doing more with fracking? I'm not so sure about that, because frankly, I don't know enough about it, and I don't know enough about the risks of it. What we certainly should have been doing is looking, really over the last 10, 20 years, thinking far more carefully about our future energy needs. And really since 2007, when the Putin kicked off the new Cold War, because that's what it is, I wish we'd call it for what it is, we should have been thinking much more carefully about the risk. Because it's all right saying, when the government says we understand Russian hybrid war, that's great. We've now got an energy crisis. So it's all right understanding Russian hybrid war, but if we're not then factoring that into our future decision-making, we're still incredibly vulnerable. We should have been giving the go-ahead to small-scale Rolls-Royce nuclear reactors years ago, instead of relying potentially on questionable Chinese technology with Chinese finance, which is a whole different geopolitical risk.
I couldn't agree more, Bob. Thank you so much for coming on. Of course, crucial German elections coming up on Sunday as well. End of the Merkel